Hello, so welcome back to the third instalment of the PowerBook. Thanks for sticking with me. What I want to talk about now is the contemporary grounding of the text in the year 2000. I want to say a few things about the lead up to the year 2000 and also the way in which I think she's using kind of contemporaneous technology to kind of really root this narrative in a kind of a period. It is a book of its time and in some ways might in the years to come appear perhaps a little bit dated because of that and be sort of locatable in that sort of very early kind of millennial kind of fiction. I then want to talk a little bit about love, which is the real kind of focus, I think, of this presentation, getting you to think about the ways in which Winterson is returning or kind of re-exploring some of these sort of universal and grand themes as well. So the text was published, as you know, in the year 2000. It's a text that I think draws our attention to different types of media. So one of the terms that I haven't used before, but you might want to think about in relation to the PowerBook, is this idea of remediation. So the ways in which the PowerBook is using different kind of textual mechanisms to reflect on other modes, other ways of experiencing text. So for example, the way in which the novel is kind of mirroring or mimicking computer screens. And you'll see the term, especially if you've got a Kindle edition of this text, repeatedly use the term window, particularly towards the end of the novel. So you might want to kind of think about that. I think its use of virtual reality, its use of a kind of an email exchange, its use of almost sort of a dating like conversation between these two protagonists, again just kind of ground the narrative in a moment of time. Unfortunately, I don't have a copy of the first edition, and I'm kicking myself that I don't. It's probably worth a little bit of money now, but if you do get the opportunity to have a look on Amazon or on eBay for a first edition, you'll see that it's a very different hardback to maybe the kind of the hardback that we'd be used to. And what it is, it's very much thinking about the book as artifacts. So what does the book kind of look like? And Kellaway, in one of the early kind of reviews of the novel, talks about it looking like a kind of an or an Apple Mac manual. Actually, a friend of mine who's got a copy of the text says you open it rather on a kind of a landscape mode. So it's actually almost opening up like a keyboard and laptop. So it's actually mirroring the kind of the technology through that form as well. So that's actually quite exciting. That again, I think, is another kind of example of the way in which she's looking to sort of experiment a little bit with the form. And somebody like B.S. Johnson, for example, and it was B.S. Johnson's novel, The Unfortunates, that I was thinking about. It's presented as a box, so a little bit different, but still in that kind of experimental mode. And I think in doing that, you may think about kind of the transformation of the novel, but you also might draw attention back to the book itself, back to its materiality, and I think that in doing so, the dualism between cyberspace and meat space, as she terms it in the novel, is actually captured as well in the physical manifestation of the book as well. So I think one of the criticisms I have of this novel, and maybe it's an unfair one, is it doesn't go far enough for me. It's not as experimental as I'd like to see. So Jenny Egan in Visits from the Goon Squad, Zadie Smith in MW, kind of using more obviously reflective text of text speak or of PowerPoint, whereas Winterson sort of keeps this slightly more ambivalent, that she's not boxing us in terms of the email. She's not giving us the kind of what you might do, which is the format of the email, which, you know, a number of texts have used, non-experimental texts actually have used kind of recently in kind of popular fiction to set up those kind of discussions. So I suppose cyberspace in the novel is kind of reflected through these kind of non-linear narratives, the way in which you might on a computer screen, and as I have at the moment, a number of tab browsers open, moving between a number of documents. So maybe rather than reading the text all the way through, what she's doing by these kind of interspersions of other narratives, is getting that sense of movement, getting the sense maybe that you could surf through this novel. Now, I don't know whether it's just me, because I tend to read a story. I like to begin at the beginning of the story I'm reading and read through to the end. And I haven't tried to kind of pick up these narratives. I haven't followed them through, but it seems to me that in the contents page, this is a text that's deliberately giving you a way of orientating through the text. So, for example, you could move through the text, I think, in different ways, other than the way in which she kind of outlines. So, for example, there are capitalised chapter headings and lowercase chapter headings, and one of the things that I'd like to do is kind of reflect on that and see if reading those chapters in a different order actually elicits a different kind of pathway through the novel itself, and whether or not that's something Winterson herself is thinking about. It seems to me it's one of the texts where she's the most obvious about the contents page and wanting us to kind of, perhaps reflect back on that. Another thing that this text does is it highlights how highly repetitious the narrative is. She's using repeated phrases, repeated words. In fact, the first line of the text, which is on my page 3, to avoid discovery I stay on the run, to discover things for myself I stay on the run, is repeated on page 157 identically. So it's creating these kind of internal strategies within the novel as a whole, which you may pick up on, you may not. You may pick up on then as you reread. I wondered whether these kind of repetitions, maybe the kind of the use of contents pages, are acting like a type of hyperlink, sort of moving you through the text. And the idea of the hyperlink is quite an interesting one, and has been used anachronistically since we have the internet and the World Wide Web, and applied to previous writers, people like T.S. Eliot, for example, in The Wasteland, the way in which the footnotes function throughout that kind of text. And that interests me because I think she's somebody, like I said before, who's very interested in that kind of modernist canon and wanting to think of herself in those kind of terms. One of the ways I think that you can think about the novel, and I think she encourages us to think about the novel, this is a story about writing. This is a story about writing that draws our attention not only to the email construction that we are all now writers, that we're kind of engaging with. I think it'd be difficult in the modern kind of Western world to get away from Facebook, Twitter, and email as a way of kind of narratizing the self, a way of engaging with textuality kind of at all times. But this is a metafictional story. She tells you about writing the story as she's writing it, and she actually draws on kind of multiple ending as a kind of a device. I think very much in the mode of John Fowles' The French Lieutenant's Woman, where towards the end of the text you get the text has the opportunity to kind of diverge into two different endings. She offers us two endings, but then actually gives us a third as well. So again, the idea of kind of rewriting the story and rewriting the story differently. So this is also a kind of a philosophical reflection on her own writing and her own act of writing. I'm writing her own story, like I said, this idea of the cover story too. So I wanted to start thinking about love, and also the ways in which love relates to her as a writer. I haven't gone into huge amounts of details about her biography. I was saying that's not always very useful, but actually in this instance, the fact that she was adopted, that she was raised in an Elm Pentecostalist environment, had a genuine influence, I think, on her attitude to love in particular. So she's somebody who's absolutely immersed in knowledge of the Bible. She's very, very knowledgeable and can recite huge amounts of kind of biblical text, and she's obviously got a very good memory for kind of doing so. But in doing that, I think she's somebody who likes to get back to this idea of divine divine love, and love being a motive force. It's both quest and it's also transformative in the texts of hers. It's also has the ability to raise characters above their kind of contemporary experience. So, as Kellaway says in her review of the text itself, she never stops trying to unriddle love, and that's a really lovely idea, actually, that idea of riddling and reading, and whether she's trying to read love as well. In Written on the Body, the translator character within that novel spends a long time lost in an illuminated manuscript, forgetting that actually the letter that he or she was tracing is of the word love. So being so lost in the detail, not being able to sort of think about love as being important to oneself. Love is certainly a central vision of hers. It's something that she repeatedly comes back to, an idea that she looks to develop. She's also, I think, exploring then the kind of the boundaries that we have around love, so constructions of marriage, potentially as well kind of familial structures as well, so structures of the family, and the way in which that can kind of get in the way of these transformative kind of descriptions of love. So I want to focus a little bit on a really important example here. The main character, Alex, sets him or herself up as a rewriter, reteller of stories, who's interested in different identities as well. And she lists, and Mrs. Winterson lists a number of what she calls great and ruinous lovers, and lovers for everybody really, heterosexual lovers, homosexual lovers, lovers that kind of change their gender as well and dress up and cross-dress in really interesting ways. But the section looking at Lancelot and Guinevere in particular, I think is really fascinating. So what I'd like us to do is pause for a moment. I'll get out the book reference for you for Lancelot and Guinevere. I'd like us to just think a little bit about that passage in particular. Okay, so I found that for you now. In my edition it's page 67 to 74, but it's the search chapter, which picks up and retells the story of Lancelot and Guinevere. So if you don't know the story of Lancelot and Guinevere, I think it would be really interesting just to have a little look online. Winterson is very deliberately writing after Thomas Malory's The Morte d'Arthur, so a particular publication of these stories in the 19th century, which she was actually very familiar with. It formed one of the only books, well, she had very few books in her home growing up, and it formed one of the books that she had access to and was able to read. Now, what's important about their story, I think, and the story of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, is the way in which love is set up as a courtly ideal, a courtly idea of love. So it's quite an area to kind of go into here, but what Malory was referring to in the 19th century is a kind of a medieval idea of love and chivalry and how knights should behave around women, and it's a really fascinating area that you can trace through. And if you're interested in this, Julie Ellen's book on Jeanette Winterson and the idea of love would be really, really useful to kind of explore this. So I think it's important that you know that. And if you've looked at the 18th century, if you've maybe looked at romantic poetry, then some of these ideas you might be familiar with as well. But what Winterson is doing here, I think, is subverting the story in some really, really interesting ways. So particularly draw your attention to page sort of 69. Lancelot is the epitome of the good knight. So he's Arthur's right-hand man, and he falls in love with and has an affair, for all intents and purposes, with Mrs. Arthur, who is Guinevere, who's the queen, and she repeatedly refuses to kind of run away with him. She ekes out her duty to the king. And I think Winterson's retelling is really pithy, and it's a really nice kind of reworking of the story. But what she does specifically in relation to gender and sex, I think, is really important, and that's what I want you to read about, looking at page kind of 69. So if you can imagine Lancelot with my fighting arm is sinew to your shoulder, my tiny feet, your tiny feet, stand my ground. In full armour I'm wearing nothing but your shift. When you plait your hair, you wind it round my head. Your eyes are green, mine are brown. When I see through your green eyes, I see the meadows bright with grass. When you creep up behind my retina, I see the flick of trout in the reeds of the lake. So what I think she's doing there is deliberately subverting the kind of the associations between the two. The sexuality, the gender of these characters becomes woven together and becomes lost. It becomes less important perhaps than the sort of the sum of their parts together through their love for one another.